So good morning, everyone. My name is Pascal McKeown. I'm the head of the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Sciences here at Queen's. And on behalf of the school and the wider university, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for attending this year's annual Gender Equality Lecture. In light of the ongoing restrictions linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are unable to hold the lecture in person this year, but I am delighted that we are able to proceed using online technology. I would like to welcome members of Dame Ingrid's family and her friends who have joined us today, including her sister, Dr. Grace Ware, and members of Grace's family, as well as many friends from the McCracken Memorial Church, including the Reverend Barry McCroskey, the Reverend Dr. Alex Wimberley, and I'd also like to thank Anne Kernahan, who has helped promote the lecture to the congregation and wider community. The school has a number of annual lectures and a small number of named lectures. In 2018, the annual Gender Equality Lecture was renamed the Dame Ingrid Allen Lecture, the first such lecture in our school to be named after a woman. This is the third Dame Ingrid Allen Lecture, and I am cognizant that it is a very poignant one, as Dame Ingrid sadly passed away in April 2020. Dame Ingrid had a very distinguished career in medicine, with an international reputation for her research in infections of the nervous system and multiple sclerosis. And I would now like to provide a short narrative about her life. Dame Ingrid graduated in medicine from Queen's with honours in 1957. She was then awarded the Doctor of Medicine degree in 1963 and in 1983 the Doctor of Science degree as a mark of her contribution to research. She was a fellow of many learned societies and colleges, including the Royal College of Pathologists, the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow, the Royal College of Physicians of London, and a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. She was also a member of the Royal Irish Academy. As a mark of her esteem, she was awarded an honorary Doctor of Medical Science degree by Queen's in 2003, and she was named on 2 occasions in the Queen's Honours List, initially CBE and then DBE for her work in medical research. From 1979 to 1997, she was a professor of neuropathology here at Queen's and also a consultant pathologist and director of the Northern Ireland Regional Neuropathology Service at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. In 1997, she was appointed as the inaugural Director of Research and Development for the Department of Health here in Northern Ireland and was responsible for developing the research strategy, Research for Health and Wellbeing, which has really put Northern Ireland's research on the world stage. She was the winner of numerous awards and the author of more than 200 publications. Her work in research contributed seminal advances in neuropathology, particularly in the fields of multiple sclerosis and neurovirology. Most notably, Professor Allen elegantly demonstrated subtle changes in what is now referred to as normal appearing white matter in the central nervous system of patients with multiple sclerosis, identifying that seemingly healthy tissue also shows pathological changes in this disease. Working with colleagues in Belfast, she also discovered that the measles virus is the cause of subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Her contributions have greatly advanced the field of multiple sclerosis research, and without doubt, the understanding she brought to this disease has supported the development of the life-changing, disease-modifying therapies in use across the world today. While at Queen's, she established the journal entitled Multiple Sclerosis. She also curated one of the largest collections of tissue from patients with demyelinating diseases, including extremely rare tissue that is still in use today, and this facilitated collaborations with world leaders in neuropathology research on the international stage. She was a member of the UK Medical Research Council. She chaired the MRC Neurosciences Board and was a member of the Higher Education Funding Council in England Joint Medical Advisory Committee. She also served as the chair of the Medical Advisory Panel of the Parkinson's Disease Society and was a member of the board of the Association of Medical Research Charities in London. Dame Ingrid continued to publish until shortly before her death. Indeed, in 2017, she co-authored a study with colleagues at Queen's, which was published in Nature Neuroscience, and my colleagues in the Multiple Sclerosis Research Cluster at Queen's, which started in 2010, have indicated how well supported they were by Dame Ingrid in terms of mentorship, collaborative support, and guidance. As a fitting tribute to Dame Ingrid, her portrait was unveiled at Queen's in November 2008. Dame Ingrid was only the third female academic from Queen's to grace the walls of the Great Hall in the main Lanyon building. Her portrait hangs alongside distinguished nephrologist, the late Professor Molly McGeown, as well as Professor Mary McAleese, formerly a Pro-Vice Chancellor at the university and former President of Ireland. At that time, Dame Ingrid said, "I consider it a great honour to have my portrait at Queen's. It is also very humbling, and I would like to pay tribute to all who have worked with me and helped me throughout my career." Just before handing over to Professor Michelle McKinley, who's the school's Director of Gender Equality, I would like to congratulate Michelle, Professor Karen McCluskey, and other colleagues in the school for leading the school's recent application to advance HE, as in late 2020, we were delighted to announce that the school had achieved an Athena Swan Gold Award for its work on gender equality. I'll now hand over to Michelle, who will introduce this year's speaker, Professor Parveen Yaqub. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for that introduction. And I'd like to extend my welcome to you all, and in particular to Dame Ingrid's family and friends. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Parveen Yaqub. Professor Yaqub has graduated with a BA in Physiological Sciences, followed by a DPhil in Biochemistry from the University of Oxford. She has been working at the University of Reading since 1998 and is currently Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation and a Professor of Nutritional Physiology. Professor Yaqub's research investigates the influence of nutrition on immunity, inflammation and vascular function, particularly with respect to cardiovascular disease. She contributes to a number of national and international research funding panels and is a member of the steering group of the BBSRC Diet and Health Industry Club, as well as sub-panel chair of the BBSRC Collaborative Training Partnerships. Professor Yaqub is Senior Lead for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Reading. She chairs the university's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board and is the University Executive Board LGBT+ Champion. She was appointed as the inaugural chair of the National Athena Swan Governance Committee, established in September 2020 to oversee transformation of the Athena Swan Charter. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Yaqub to give the 2020 Dame Ingrid Allen Lecture. Professor Yaqub, we look forward to hearing about your career journey as a girl scientist and leader.
Michelle, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today, and it's an honour and a privilege to be delivering the Dame Ingrid Allen Lecture in memory. I'm going to start by explaining the title of my lecture while I share my screen. So hopefully you can see that now.
Yes, it's coming up now. Perfect.
So I chose this title, Girl Scientist Leader, because at a very simple level, it's a reflection of 3 stages in my life and career. And as you'll hear today, my experiences as a girl growing up in a culture that was skewed towards valuing boys were the foundation for my path towards becoming a scientist and then a leader. But it's also a nod towards Bernardine Evaristo's Booker Prize-winning novel, Girl, Woman, Other, The book follows the interconnected lives of 12 women and explores how race, gender, sexuality, history, and economic stratification intersect to define their experiences. Intersectionality has defined my experiences. Both race and gender inequality are featured significantly, so I'm going to talk about both. And a warning, the content can be frank and uncompromising in places. So let me start by allowing you some insight into my early life by opening up my family album. I was born in South London, the middle of 5 children. We were 4 girls and 1 boy, to parents who were immigrants from Pakistan. My dad was a bus conductor when he first arrived in the UK, but once he'd saved up enough money, he bought a shop called Nagina, which means gem. It was one of the earliest shops selling Asian foods and halal meat and became the heart of a small community. Our customers became aunts and uncles, and there was always someone having a cup of tea or a samosa and a chat at the back of the shop. We all lived in a tiny flat above the shop. My dad had been educated up to the age of about 14. He was quite intelligent and probably would have liked to have had a proper education. But my mother had never been allowed to go to school and never learned to read or write, and she had very traditional views. And as we were 4 girls and 1 boy, it was made very clear to me from a very early age that boys were valued more than girls. Education was mainly for boys. The main role of girls was to be married off as soon as possible. And just to give you a few examples of what being a girl in my world was like, when my youngest sister was born, my mother wouldn't see her for 3 days in the hospital, so distraught was she that it wasn't another boy. I can reassure you that my sister turned out fine. There was no long-term damage. She's a very successful journalist now. But I remember being 13 and being at home with my 2 younger sisters when my mother returned from a shopping trip and found my dad making a cup of tea in the kitchen. And she went absolutely ballistic because there were 3 girls in the house, and yet the man of the house was making his own cup of tea. And I remember her shouting, "What is wrong with you girls?" My memory of being 14 is overhearing my parents talking about getting me engaged to a cousin in Pakistan by the time I was 16. Luckily for me, that didn't happen. My elder sister had already been married to a cousin from Pakistan, but it had very quickly gone wrong, and my parents decided to hold off to reassess. So these experiences had a huge influence on me growing up because they gave me a determination, a quiet determination to make my own decisions about what I was going to do with my life. So I guess you could say I'm where I am both despite my background and because of it. There were some positives, it wasn't all negative. So there was a strong sense of community amongst the first generation of immigrants who had left behind everything they knew to establish a new life in a new country. And I saw what a difference it made when people stepped up and made a contribution and worked together to help each other. I watched my dad make hundreds of samosas by hand every time there was a festival or a community gathering. And that sense of stepping up and making a contribution has stayed with me from a very early age. The other major influence in my early years was being a second generation British Pakistani, growing up in the skinhead era of the 70s and 80s. After about 10 years of running the shop, my dad sold Nagina and decided that he was British enough to buy a fish and chip shop across the road. So he swapped the samosas for battered cod. But 3 days after opening, a man walked into the shop and said, "We don't want Pakis running our fish and chip shop," and walked out again. There was a local campaign against us, mainly graffiti, sometimes broken windows, and Dad had to sell the shop after 3 months. Any person of colour who grew up in the 70s and 80s will understand that that was absolutely what normal life was like. It was completely normal to experience racist abuse in the streets, to come home from school to find racist graffiti all over your front door, to have your bedroom window smashed while you were sitting at your desk doing your homework. And I think it's important to tell you this because you can probably imagine that if you grow up with normal life looking like that, then it might affect the way that you interact with people, the extent to which you trust people, how you are around strangers or unfamiliar places, how likely you are to put yourself in situations outside your comfort zone, how likely you are to want to make yourself visible, because if being visible has always come with a degree of danger, then it's quite hard to turn that around to be proactive about being visible. When we think about the barriers for underrepresented groups to take on visible roles, we never think or talk about any of that. The students and the colleagues that we interact with every day might have those invisible barriers. And unless we're prepared to recognise that and to do something about it, we're turning our backs on vast amounts of untapped potential. School was my saviour when I was growing up, and that will sound odd to many children, but it was the only place where I felt I had a degree of freedom and somewhere I could be myself because my home life was quite restricted. I went to quite a multiracial state school. It really suited me because I've always been comfortable in a diverse environment, but the standard of teaching was absolutely appalling. So I became self-reliant at a very early age, buying secondhand books or borrowing them from the library so that I could teach myself maths and physics. And as so often happens in adversity, that helped me enormously later in life because I became very independent intellectually at a much younger age than I otherwise would have done. The school was so poor that as soon as I'd completed my O-levels, it was announced that it was going to be closed, and it was to reopen as the Brit School, the school that Adele and many other performers have graduated from. Now, I couldn't sing or dance, and I knew I didn't want to try to do my A-levels there. So I ended up in the unusual situation of not having a school place for sixth form. And that's when my dad stepped in and saved the day by arranging an interview for sixth form at a private school where I ended up getting a free place. That was a total culture shock. It was very white middle class and I found it really hard. But I did stick with it, and I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't. It forced me to cope with being in an environment where I didn't fit in and felt completely out of my comfort zone. And it also led to me getting a place at university. We were the first generation of children born to immigrant parents who had the opportunity to go to university. Not very many did at first, and those that did tended to live at home. My brother was 3 years older than me, and he was very academic. He went to Oxford to read physics. And I remember looking at him and thinking, if he can do it, so can I. So that's exactly what I did. It wasn't a given that I would be allowed to go, even once I was offered a place. But my dad was kind of basking in the glory of having one of the first children in the community go to Oxford. And I guess the social currency of having 2 children at Oxford was too good to pass up. So I went and I read physiology in 1987. When my brother graduated from Oxford, my parents gave him a holiday to Egypt to celebrate his success. When I graduated 3 years later, I was given a pair of wedding bangles. There's a picture of them here in the bottom of the slide, looking rather unfortunately like a pair of handcuffs. I guess they were meant to send me a strong message, that's it, you're done. But I wasn't done. What I hadn't got around to telling my parents was that I'd already secured a place to do a PhD in biochemistry, and I was intending to go back to Oxford in September. My mother's response to that news was, if she gets 2 degrees, how on earth are we going to find her a husband who has 4? Now, in a bizarre twist of fate, while I was doing my PhD, I met someone who actually does have 2 PhDs. Don't ask me why, it's a long story. He didn't remotely meet any of the other criteria that my parents might have required, race, religion, none of that. But he did have 2 PhDs, and it was so deliciously ironic that it felt like it was just meant to be, and so it was. There were some very difficult years to follow that, and I was very conscious of the fact that in exerting my own freedom of choice, I might have removed or restricted freedom of choice from other girls in the community, other daughters whose parents were making decisions about whether or not to allow them to go away to university, and that was a heavy burden to bear. But a few years later, I was appointed as a lecturer in human nutrition here at Reading at the age of 29 in 1998, and I've been here ever since. I've never actually studied nutrition, but my research had naturally led me in that direction. And the university had just established a new department and was about to launch some new courses. So it proved to be a good opportunity to take on responsibility and to progress. And I guess it's relevant to consider, given how I began this lecture, whether gender or race inequality have featured at all in my career. The answer is yes, they have. Race more than gender, although there's an element of intersectionality about my experiences. People get very touchy about any mention of white privilege, but my view is that if you're white, you never have to think about your skin colour. You never come away from a conversation or an encounter wondering whether you were spoken to like that or treated like that because of your skin colour. And that's a privilege. So I can give you some examples of being reminded of my skin colour in a professional setting. When I was first appointed as a lecturer in Reading, I was invited, along with 3 other new lecturers, to have lunch with 2 very senior figures in the university. During the lunch, one of them spoke about a lecture that he had delivered the previous evening. He talked about looking out at a sea of faces and remarked that not a single one of them was British. I didn't say anything at the time, but of course I wanted to ask him exactly what he thought a British face looked like. At a conference in London quite recently, I was a plenary speaker, and unusually there was another female Asian speaker on the programme. Despite the fact that we didn't look anything like each other, 2 participants mistook her for me. It was as if they just couldn't see past our skin colour. And while that might seem like a minor mistake, I think there are far-reaching implications there. What's the likelihood, for example, of either of us being invited to speak elsewhere or be invited for another opportunity if the only thing that people can remember about us is that we were brown? People of colour sometimes talk about having to work twice as hard to prove their worth. And my own experience is that if I'm invited to sit on a panel or offered a prestigious opportunity, a small part of me will wonder whether I'm there to fill a diversity quota, and then I'll usually work twice as hard to prove that I deserve to be there on the basis of my ability. In 2015, there was a major turning point in my career and a watershed moment for me personally. Up to that point, I'd begun to take a few lower level leadership roles, but then my head of school moved on to a dean position, and people started to ask me if I would apply for the vacant head of school post. I said I wasn't interested, but then something happened that changed everything. I'd been invited to a STEM event for Year 9 girls aimed at encouraging them to consider a career in science along with 5 other women. We were there as role models to answer questions and to dispel myths about our careers. And as we began the session, the facilitator asked us each to stand up and explain why we'd agreed to take part. I stood up and found myself saying that there were very few women in top level positions in universities and that I wanted to see that change. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I knew that I couldn't stand on the sidelines any longer, and that if I wasn't willing to put myself forward, then I had no right to tell a group of 14-year-olds, or anyone else for that matter, that I wanted or expected things to change. And since that watershed moment, the phrase, be the change you want to see, has become something of a personal mantra for me. It's commonly attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, and it was echoed beautifully in Amanda Gorman's poem at the inauguration of President Biden last week, when she said, "There is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." So when I got back to the office, I took a deep breath and began to prepare my application. And later that year, I took up the role of head of chemistry, food and pharmacy, which I held for 3 years. It was extremely valuable leadership experience, which came at a time when I wasn't actually able to travel because I had primary responsibility for childcare. So it allowed me to develop and progress in a way that I hadn't entirely anticipated at the beginning of my career. When I'd been in the role for 2 years, my line manager, Robert Vandenoord, who was then a pro-vice-chancellor and is now the vice-chancellor, began to encourage me to consider the role of pro-vice-chancellor for research and innovation, which was going to be vacated the following year. He spoke to me about it so often that I knew I needed to give it some serious thought. So I took the opportunity of having some coaching. The university provides 6 free coaching sessions to anyone in the leadership group, and I use those sessions to weigh up the pros and cons of stepping up to a pro-vice-chancellor role. The main concerns that I had were a negative impact on my research profile and work-life balance. But through those coaching sessions, I came to the conclusion that applying as a job share might address both of those concerns. I'd already seen a recent job share in action in the form of our Dean for Diversity and Inclusion role, and that was the first senior job share in the university. So I decided to take a leap of faith and applied as an open job share with the view that I would be willing to work with any other applicant, even though I didn't know who any of them were at that stage. Looking back on it now, I realise it was probably quite a risky thing to do, but I wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone. And of course, the motivation to step up and be visible as a non-white female was a key driver. So I took up the role as a job share in August 2018 with Dominic Zaum, an expert in international relations, as my job share partner. He'd also applied as a job share for exactly the same reasons as me. And we took up the role on the basis of each of us committing 60% to the PVC role, with the remaining 40% representing our role as academics in our home school. So for me, this meant that in theory, I could spend 2 days a week managing my research team, doing a bit of teaching, taking roles on external funding panels and so on, and the remaining 3 days working as a PVC. The reality has been a bit different from that, because it's quite hard to separate out the two parts of your job. And for both of us, the PVC role is definitely more than 60%. Before COVID, I did spend Fridays in another office close to my research team, so I did at least have that time when I was available for them, but it has been almost impossible to keep that up over the last year. Now, before we took up our roles, Dominic and I set out clearly how we were going to make it work and who would take responsibility for what. We have 4 research themes, so we took 2 each. I lead on open research and research integrity, and the Concordat for research integrity. Dominic leads on postgraduate research student development and the Concordat to support that. I lead on interdisciplinarity, Dominic leads on innovation. So there were some clear lines on remit that we drew up at the beginning. Because of his background, Dominic's really strong on governance, whereas I'm stronger on operations. So there's a natural split in our strengths there. It took a few months to develop effective ways of working, and it was worth investing a bit of time in that. And I think sharing an office really helped, because communication is absolutely key. Although there was one occasion in the early days when we were co-chairing a meeting and someone asked a question, one of us said yes and the other one said no at exactly the same time. It was very awkward, but we're much less likely to do that now, because one of us will usually preempt the questions we're likely to get. We'll have discussed our position ahead of the meeting, and dare I say, I sometimes even know what Dominic's going to say before he says it, which is quite smugly satisfying. There's a lot of curiosity about our job share externally, and in the beginning, internally also, people would make a big deal out of telling us that they weren't quite sure which one of us to speak to about an issue, but that rarely happens now, which I think is a good sign. It's also really key that you have roughly the same expectations on turnaround time. Dominic and I both respond to things really quickly, and that helps because it means we don't have a situation where one of us is always waiting for the other person to make progress. I see our job share as 2 people doing one job. There are many parts of the job that either of one of us could step into if the other person couldn't do it, so there's resilience there. But there are a few areas where we wouldn't be able to do that because they're quite specialist. So for me, it's the university partnership with the NHS. For Dominic, it's his work with innovation centres and the army. And we're setting a trend. So there's now another PVC job share on University Executive Board. The PVC education role was appointed as a job share a year ago, and we're increasingly seeing people applying for senior positions as job shares across the organisation. So we do feel a bit like trailblazers. And our Vice Chancellor says that the benefit of him having a PVC job share is that when we bring things to him, they're already well developed because we've already discussed them ourselves, and he can therefore get quickly to a higher level conversation. For me, having someone who is as committed to the same goals as you and who can share the highs and lows has been a revelation, and it's changed me personally. I'm much more collaborative as a result, much more likely to seek other people's opinions, and yet more confident when it comes to decision making. It will, without doubt, influence the way that I work with people in the future. It already has, and I hope that it means that we model positive working behaviours to others. When I'd been in the PVC role for a year, Robert, the Vice-Chancellor, asked me if I would be willing to take on the role of Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and that is in addition to the PVC role and the 40% academic role. So in terms of workload, it's quite significant. But once again, the be the change you want to see was my guiding force. And so on the 1st of January last year, I became the university's first ever female Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and at the same time, the university's first ever non-white Deputy Vice-Chancellor. Having a champion and a mentor at any stage of your career can be life-changing. And Robert has been my line manager for just over 5 years now, and he's pushed me at every step, and I can't emphasize enough how valuable it's been to have someone back me like that. I did wonder whether the title of my talk should have been Girl Scientist, Leader and Mother, because like many academics, I balance my work life with my role as a parent. I had my son in 2006 when I was 38, already fairly well established and with a track record that gave me some stability. I returned to work after 8 months of maternity leave, initially at 80%, but going full time in 2016, not long after stepping up to become head of school. And it hasn't been easy to maintain work-life balance, particularly because I'm the primary carer, but I don't think I would have it any other way. Now, alongside my roles as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation and Deputy Vice Chancellor, I also have the important role of being University Executive Board Lead for Diversity and Inclusion. And that involves chairing the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board and also line managing the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. My vision is to lead diversity and inclusion in a university that is committed to continuous education and improvement. And I actually created this roadmap completely by accident when I was trying to make a list of practical things that people could do to personally contribute to equality, diversity and inclusion. You can use it to illustrate how anyone can begin by understanding the goals and the visions of an organisation, their role in it, before taking the first steps to doing something proactive, such as becoming a champion or an ally, and then being prepared to start a journey towards becoming culturally competent, educating others, and committing to continuous improvement. This collective commitment is really important to me because I get frustrated when I see people pointing to others and asking what they're doing. I hear them say, you need to provide training for them because they're the problem, as if doing that will solve everything. I see that as a convenient decoy to say train them and things will be much better, or put some resource into doing that because it will make things much better, because it excuses people from examining their own commitment and what they're doing to make a difference. In September this year, I was appointed to my first external D&I role as the inaugural chair of the Athena Swan Governance Committee, which has been tasked with overseeing the transformation of the Athena Swan Charter. That followed an independent review which criticised the excessive bureaucracy and shortcomings in transparency and consistency of awards. There's a real urgency now in rebuilding trust and currency in the Charter in light of the recent decoupling of equality charters from some funding requirements, and also the fact that the pandemic has brought gender inequality into sharp relief. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought intersectionality to the fore. Athena Swan has no doubt had a positive impact on white women, but the data for women of colour, particularly black women, is dismal. And as you will have realised, this is a subject that's close to my heart. The Athena Swan Governance Committee has appointed short-term specialist groups to advise specifically on intersectionality, but also on gender as a spectrum, and professional and technical and operational directorates in higher education. I want to finish with some reflection on how a girl like me became a scientist and then a leader. I firmly believe that the inequalities I experienced enabled me to develop the resilience that I needed to get to where I am now. I've talked about the challenges. They included growing up in an environment where girls were not valued, learning to be intellectually self-reliant from an early age as a result of being in a very poor school, growing up as a BAME female and having lived experience of racial prejudice throughout my life, and balancing a career with family responsibility. For me, these challenges inspired the development of three of the key domains of resilience: composure, tenacity, sense of purpose. Taking a job share transformed the way that I work with people and made me much more collaborative. I'm sure a small part of that comes from the sense of community that I experienced when I was a girl. And my role as Deputy Vice Chancellor, leading the university through a pandemic, has developed my resourcefulness, problem solving and planning at a pace that I could never have imagined a year ago. There's probably not a single person listening today who hasn't had challenges of some description in their lives, and particularly over the last year. But the resilience that we draw from those challenges can be absolutely invaluable. And I want to leave you with these images and these words from the events of last week. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Jacob, for such a poignant, thoughtful, inspiring lecture. We certainly appreciate your frank and uncompromising perspective. I think we need to hear, more from people about the reality of their journeys, the reality of, I suppose, how gender stereotypes still persist and are very strong within society, and how they feed into really unconscious bias and implicit bias in how people see each other in society. We have some questions that have been submitted in advance, so if you're happy, I will ask a few of the questions that have come through. So the first one is, what strategies do we need to implement to get more diversity in research institutions, for example, based on ethnicity and social class?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I wasn't sure whether the question was specifically about research institutes or universities, but I'll try to answer this broadly. So I think we've been doing widening participation for a number of years, but I think what's missing is that really difficult thing of creating a sense of belonging for people. And that's not necessarily about strategy. Having strategy is obviously important. It's about culture. I've heard applicants for courses and people who've applied for jobs say things like, I felt terrified of the place. I didn't feel I would belong there, or I didn't feel I would fit in. And they say it as if it's their fault. But it shouldn't be seen as their fault. We should be creating an environment that makes everyone feel like they could belong. And I can give you a story about somebody who applied for a job at Reading and was offered the job. And a few months after they'd been in the job, they emailed me to say that when they came for interview, they walked around campus and they saw about 30% of people wearing lanyards, rainbow lanyards with the words LGBT plus ally on them. And when they walked past offices, they noticed that quite a few of the offices had rainbow postcards with LGBT ally logo on there. And just seeing that made them feel that if they worked in a place like this, that they would belong. So I think a lot of it is about culture and creating a sense of belonging and creating a sense of inclusiveness.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely echoes the importance that we have in our school on culture. I mean, we can have all of these action plans and we can have all of these things on paper, but if the culture isn't right, then individuals don't feel they belong and they want to stay there and pursue a career in that place. So I think it's absolutely imperative that we focus on culture, and it's lovely to have the awards like the Athena Swan Awards, of course, and other charters that exist. But I think what we all strive for is that really positive culture that we can be proud of. The second question is, if you could change one thing in all UK universities today, what would it be?
Do you know, I'm going to give you a really short answer to this, and that is make the top look more like the bottom. I think that says it all, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Could I follow on from that and ask, do you think we are starting to see a change in leadership in terms of what leadership looks like, what leadership styles look like? Do you think we're starting to see more of a range of leadership styles compared to previous decades? In your experience as a senior leader within a university, have you started to see some change coming through?
I think so. I think we are thinking about leadership in a much more inclusive way. At Reading, only 4 years ago, our university executive board was all white and all male. So things have changed very quickly. Sometimes it doesn't take very much to change things, but then those changes have to be sustainable. And I think we're doing that by the positive messages that we're sending out, particularly about being open to job sharing. So all positions, all senior positions, and actually most non-senior positions currently are advertised with wording that says we would be willing to consider this as a job share. And I would not have applied for the PVC role if it had not been for the possibility of a job share, because I didn't want to do the job on my own. And offering senior positions as job shares has resulted in more women feeling that they can apply. So I think it is possible to think about leadership in a more inclusive way, but you have to make sure that what the changes that you make are sustainable and that they will lead to progressive change, and also that you do it in a way that models positive working behaviours to others.
Absolutely. I think the job share for those senior positions is a really strong message that the University of Reading is sending out, and has set a really strong example in the sector with that. And it's certainly something that features within our action plan in terms of our Athena Swan action plan in our school. So thank you very much for paving the way and showing another way of encouraging more people into leadership positions. Okay, I'm just looking to see what next question. So moving on to thinking about your own career, what is the single most important piece of advice you received during your career?
I think this is quite a recent piece of advice, and it's about building allies, because I think building allies is one of the most valuable things you can do. You always need people who will support and champion you. And I've learned, particularly over the last year, in the work that I've done in leading the university through the pandemic, I've had to work with individuals right across the university at all levels. And you very quickly find out who you can trust, who you can rely on. There are people I would trust with my life now, such as being their willingness to step up. So I think building allies is absolutely key.
Thank you. You've just mentioned your role in leading the university during the pandemic, and you came into a leadership role at a particularly challenging time during the past year. From what you've seen, do you feel COVID has impacted disproportionately on female staff within your university, and how has the university supported staff during the pandemic?
I do believe that there has been some inequality in terms of the impact, and actually there's evidence that lower numbers of publications by female authors, for example, have been reported by journals. We've done some quantitative analysis quite recently across the university, and although it doesn't show an inequality in the impact of the pandemic, a gender inequality, we think there's likely to be a lag. And that we will see inequalities for the next 2 or 3 years, and we need to be prepared to address those. But the other thing I think to bear in mind is that numbers don't tell you everything. And as chair of our Diversity, Inclusion and Advisory Board, I'm asking the leads of all of our networks. So we have gender equality networks, we have BAME network, we have disability network, and so on. I'm asking the leads of all of those networks, I'm asking our Athena Swan self-assessment team, our race equality action team, to have an in-depth qualitative look at what inequalities they see having arisen amongst staff as a result of the pandemic, what has arisen for students as a result of the pandemic. Are they new inequalities, or has the pandemic magnified the existing inequalities? What solutions have they already identified, and what resource do they need? And how could the networks actually work together with using that resource to address the inequalities they're seeing. I think we need to talk to people ground level rather than look at numbers, because a lot of this is going to be qualitative. And one of the things that we're doing immediately is starting to think about putting resource into research leave or study leave specifically to address pandemic related disadvantage that particular people have experienced.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important, and you mentioned the lag in the data, and I think that's something we have to bear in mind, is that we will be feeling the effects of the pandemic on academic careers for many years to come. So we're really only starting to see some of the reports being published now in the leading medical journals, even of differences in experiences during the pandemic, but that's going to affect us for years to come.
And you have to think about the impact of that on probationary procedures, on promotions. How do we take this into account? And particularly if there are inequalities between different groups within the university.
Absolutely. And it is that big question of how do we take it into account. Professor Karen McCluskey has been doing some work in Queen's at an institutional level, very similar to what you've been doing, it sounds like. So a survey trying to look quite in depth at the impact of the pandemic to see if there are particular patterns that are coming out for different groups, and there are certainly some indications in that data so far that there are some gender disparities, but also what comes through very strongly is the qualitative, the free text responses that come through from the surveys, and that's the same when we did our own school survey, and a lot of the really valuable insights that you get are from those free text comments in surveys, and strong messages about valuing the flexible working arrangements that have been put in place during the pandemic. So although there have been many challenges, there are some positives coming out of the pandemic that we are seeing. There are some good working practices we are seeing that people are very keen to hold on to. And I think that increased opportunity for flexible working across all levels of staff, not just academic staff, has been one of the most notable changes we've seen. And it's certainly in the qualitative responses that come through, it comes through really strongly as something people would like to hold on to. Is that something that is also being discussed within Reading?
Yeah, I guess it will affect different people in different ways. And I suspect that the worst affected are going to be women with young children, particularly if they have several young children. I think the other thing that occurs to me is that the sort of living at work phenomenon in the long term could be quite damaging in terms of well-being, and not being able to separate work from home. I certainly found that in the period between July and December, when I was going to work every day, that mental separation from being at home was so valuable. And yeah, so I think there's not a one size fits all. It's about the opportunity to take some of the things that did work and to use them as flexibly as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm just having a look. I still have a few questions here that I would like to ask. So one, again, about your own personal career. What was your biggest struggle in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
I wouldn't say I've had big struggles, because I think of myself as quite a resilient person. But like many people, I've probably suffered from imposter syndrome now and then. And I remember an occasion when I had just recently become head of school, and I was talking to someone who'd been head of school for a few years, and he asked me how it was going. And I said, it's going okay, but when I introduce myself, I sometimes feel that people are thinking, could they not find anybody else? And he said to me, and you probably project that. And I thought, I do project that, and I've got to stop doing it. And that was it was one of those moments where somebody says something to you and you think, not going to do that anymore. So I try to keep that in mind every time I walk into a room, and think I don't have quite the presence, and I've got that bit of imposter syndrome creeping in. I think of Ben Kosh, who said those words to me, and straighten my back and occupy the space.
It's remarkable that someone in your position, suffers from imposter syndrome. But
Everybody
I think that
does. Everybody does.
I think we can all relate to that. So thank you very much for sharing. I think that's really good advice from your colleague as well. You've mentioned a few times coaching, and we hear a lot about mentoring. So do you see a value in coaching versus mentoring in terms of developing leadership qualities and developing yourself as a leader?
So I've only had one period of coaching, and that was 6 sessions, and it came at a critical time when I didn't know what the future looked like for me. I'd been head of school for a few years, and as I said, my line manager was trying to encourage me to step up into the pro vice chancellor role, and that had raised all sorts of questions of what am I going to do with my life. So I took 6 coaching sessions. I took 3 in the period that I was trying to decide whether to apply or not, and then one when I was offered the job and I was in a panic, and then I took the final 2 when I'd been in the job for a short period of time, and having that coaching through that transition period was so valuable to me. I had a coach who she wasn't an academic, she didn't work in university, she worked much more broadly than that, but I enjoyed having that fresh perspective. She was familiar with what academic work is like, so there was that level of familiarity, but she asked me those questions. She never gave me answers. It was all about thinking through what was important to me, and I think she emphasized very frequently the importance of authenticity, and I would often use the word, I think I should do this, and she would always question why I was saying should. Why should? Why are you saying should when you should be saying want? And it really helped me to make up my mind to apply for the post. And actually, once I had been offered it, I think I approached it in a different way from how I would have if I hadn't had the coaching. And actually, when Robert asked me if I would be willing to step up into the deputy vice chancellor role, I didn't even need coaching then, because I was having conversations with her in my head when I was thinking about whether to do it or not. So if you have a really good coach, they get you to a place where you're able to self-coach.
It's really interesting and very valuable at that transition point.
Yeah.
Then in particular, I think that's really useful, to consider, because we often consider mentoring and really value having very positive mentors, and we can all relate to that. People who have really changed your career path and are there to provide constant support. But coaching at particular stages,
yep.
It could be really supportive as well. Okay, I have then another question is, you mentioned a few times that you had primary caregiving responsibility for your son. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, do you have any advice for people in terms of, if you are, and not everybody, but a lot of people with children are in dual working households, and you have maybe 2 people who are trying to have a career, and any advice for people in that regard on how to navigate that with your partner, and how to juggle work with being a mum as well?
I think the key is there's no one size fits all at all. And so my partner is also an academic, but he travelled a lot. So in the normal world before the pandemic, he would sometimes be in 2 or 3 different countries every week, and so primary responsibility for childcare was always going to be with me, and I was comfortable with that. I was absolutely fine with that. I think one of my advantages was that I was already quite senior when I had him. I was already at reader level, and therefore I was able to step back for a short period of time, knowing that I would have the security of a job to go back to. And it might mean that there's a bit of a dip in my publications and my research income, but I was comfortable with that. And I also negotiated working at 0.8 FTE, so I didn't go back full time to begin with. I worked 5 days, but finished at 4 o'clock. I made it very clear to everybody that I finished at 4 o'clock, and I wasn't prepared to book any meetings in my diary beyond that. Even when I was head of school, it was an understanding. And actually, I think that did shift the culture a little bit. So I think you just have to be firm about where your priorities are and stick with them. And sometimes it does mean that you have to not be stressed about having a dip in publications or a dip in some aspect of your CV, because and not try to do everything and not try to impact on your well-being and stress yourself out about not being able to do everything, because you will get back there eventually.
Thank you. That's really good advice. And I guess the thing about an academic career is it's generally a long one. So you have a lot of years to spend working in academia, and it's important then to find that work-life balance alongside it. Another question we have is, how do we better reward and value activities more likely to be undertaken by women? So, for example, time spent, women might spend more time on committees, on pastoral support for students, which reduces their time for writing papers and grants. So how do we reward and value those activities?
I think this is a really good question. And personally, I think that we fundamentally need to change the way that activities are allocated in the first place, and that institutions need to be accountable for transparency and fairness in the way that they apply that activity. And partly related to that, one of the things that we're working on as part of the transformation of the Athena Swan Charter is recognition and reward for equality work that individuals do. So there's a lot of disparity between how citizenship roles like leading an Athena Swan application are rewarded. And in the Transform Charter, what we're hoping is that there'll be a specific criterion addressing that, and the applicants will need to demonstrate how they recognise and reward equality work in their applications. And we're also in the process of compiling examples of good practice on that. So we would expect to see information about how equality work is rewarded in the promotions process, for example.
Yeah,
so that's going to be new in the charter.
Excellent. I think that's really valuable. And you also mentioned, with regard to the charter, I suppose more attention is being devoted to looking at gender as a spectrum. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I don't know very much more about that yet, because we on the governance committee, we don't have the expertise. So we've appointed a specialist subgroup. They've met once already, and they're going to have a couple more meetings over the spring and then report back to us. So we need to develop a charter that is fit for today, and that means that we need to be able to understand how to include gender as a spectrum. The reason it's difficult is because we have these black and white targets, don't we? And how do you address gender as a spectrum if you've got these black and white targets? So we're hoping that the specialist subgroup will give us some guidance on that. And also, once we've had that guidance, we'll be consulting with the sector.
Excellent. That'll be really valuable work, and very well received by higher education. So I think that is all the questions. Well, there's just one final question I see on the list. Could you tell us about the evidence base for practices that address gender inequalities in higher education?
So there is evidence that debiasing systems rather than people can work. And the sorts of things that I'm thinking about are including multiple women in recruitment and promotion panels, using structured interviews so that you have a level playing field, so that you're not favouring one candidate above the other without some sort of structure behind it. Equality in negotiating pay is an interesting one. And this might be about being transparent about salary ranges. So it's quite well known that women are less likely to negotiate pay on appointments than men. And actually, if you're clear about the salary ranges, both to the hiring manager and the person who's being appointed, that can help. Improving flexibility for both men and women. Mentorship and sponsorship that we've talked about, formal networking programs. And my understanding is that the things that have had less positive results are things like unconscious bias training and diversity training. I've always been a bit cynical about training, because I think that the person who is taking the training needs to be open to it and needs to want to do it, and quite often the training is seen as mandatory, and therefore it doesn't have the effect that it's meant to. And some people think that leadership training is based on a deficit model, and therefore, you know, that there's something that needs to be corrected or needs to be enhanced in somebody, and so there's a bit of a mixed opinion on that. So I think the things where there is evidence base are the things that involve, a lot of them involve recruitment, but structured interviews, equality in negotiating pay, flexibility for both men and women, mentoring and sponsorship.
Thank you. That's perfect. And we're going to end with one final question. And it's a general one, but an important one. Is gender equality a concern for men?
The short answer to that is it should be. I think too often we leave those who have protected characteristics to do all of the work, to carry the entire burden of equality work. And actually that's the case for all protected characteristics. Race, disability, we need to address that. And I think one of the ways to address that is allyship, because if you have a really good allyship program, and at Reading we have a fantastic LGBT plus allyship program that has really worked, and we're trying to learn from that for other protected characteristics. I think that's the way forward, but also being much more transparent about equality of opportunity is also key. So yes, gender equality should be a concern for men.
And can I just follow on and ask, you know, in your experience in University of Reading, have men been as open to becoming involved in gender equality work as women, in terms of your committees that you have, and in driving the agenda? Because I suppose, you know, we're only going to see real change and sustained change if everyone is behind it.
I don't think we're anywhere near to where we want to be yet, and I think that's probably the same for many universities. And membership of committees is one of the things that I bang on about a lot. I think in the Transformed Athena Swan Charter, there might be more of an emphasis on that, making sure that everybody is doing their bit. I've actually got an idea that I've been floating at the university for some time, which is that above a certain grade, you shouldn't be able to be promoted or get a salary increment unless you have done something which has had an impact on equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's like citizenship points. And if you haven't done anything to contribute to equality, diversity, and inclusion, you don't get a pay rise and you don't get promoted. Nobody's accepted that idea yet, but I'm still pushing it. I'm still trying.
I like that. I like that. And it really feeds into what you said during your talk, that, you know, it's about examining your own commitment.
Yes.
To change and what you're doing to make a difference. And, you know, that is very much about getting people to reflect on their own commitment to having a positive culture and contributing to that positive culture. So I really like that idea. I'm conscious of time, and that I've asked you so many questions, because we had so many questions that came through. Thank you for taking them all. I really appreciate it. Before my final remarks, I would just like to thank Erin Davidson for her professional organisation of the lecture. Erin, I'm very grateful for all your help and your professional event management expertise. So thank you very much. And I'd really just like to close by sincerely thanking Parveen for giving so generously of her time today for such a thoughtful, inspiring, poignant lecture that I'm sure that we will all remember for many years to come. So thank you sincerely, Parveen. We really appreciate your Dame Ingrid Allen lecture.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.